In this lesson, we're going to learn your first 9 chords on the guitar. A, E, D, A minor, E minor, D minor, G, C, and F. We'll find out why it's important to learn them in this particular order. I'll give you some useful memory hooks to make sure you don't forget the new shapes. And I'll give you some songs you can start playing immediately with these chords. We'll also talk about one thing that most beginners miss when they're starting out on the guitar. And keeping this in mind will really help your progress. Make sure you check out the article that goes along with this lesson at guitarnutrition.com. You'll also be able to download a PDF so you can have the chords right there when you're practicing. There are a couple of reasons why I think we should start with the A, the E, and the D chord. First of all, they're 3 of the easiest shapes to play on the guitar. That doesn't mean we should find them easy. Guitar is an instrument that requires us to apply force to these strings. And there's some resistance. If we haven't conditioned our hand so we have the strength and dexterity to play these, then they're gonna sound a little rough no matter how easy they are. But that's okay. The more you get used to these shapes, the better you'll be able to play them. So the 3 of the easiest shapes to play on the guitar, they also happen to be the 1, 4, and 5 chord in the key of A. You don't really need to understand what that means right now, other than the fact that learning these chords together, because they're the 1, 4, and 5 chord in the key of A, means we'll be able to jump in and start playing a whole bunch of songs immediately. Let's go over some hacks and memory hooks we can use to remember A when we're playing it. To play A, we're gonna put our first finger, 2nd fret, on the D string, 2nd finger, 2nd fret on the G string, and 3rd finger, 2nd fret on the B string. You'll notice I have to bring my fingers back a little bit to fit them all in. That's okay, sometimes we just have to compensate. I like to say that there are 3 tips for a good sounding chord. And if you get these 3 tips right, your chord should sound fantastic. The pressing hard. We're not pressing hard, we're gonna have it's not gonna sound very nice. Using the tips of our fingers. If we don't use the tips of our fingers, the finger will hang over and mute the string underneath, and that won't sound any good. So pressing hard, tips of fingers. The other one is fretting position. We always wanna be playing every note we can about 3/4 of the way up the fret. We obviously can't do this for the A chord. Sometimes we have to compensate. But if we keep these things in mind, we'll always be moving in that direction. A little hack that I like to use to remember the A chord is it kind of looks like a 1, right? They're all in a line like a 1. And A is the first letter of the alphabet. So that's a good little hack. We can remember which strings our fingers go on because we need to have an open A string at the bottom of the chord when we play it. The bass note always gives context to the other notes that we hear. So if we're playing an A chord, we need to have an A in the bass. And if we have our fingers up here, all of a sudden we don't have an open A in the bass. So remember, the A chord looks like a 1, and A is the first letter of the alphabet. Next, we're gonna learn our E chord. For this one here, we've got our first finger in the 1st fret on the G string, our 2nd and 3rd fingers in the 2nd fret on the A and D strings. You can see that this chord, it's much easier to have great fretting position. My 2nd finger is still a bit further back, but I've got 2 fingers in the frets, so you know that's all good. Maybe I'm stretching this a little bit, but I like to think that this E chord kind of looks like a lowercase e. Kind of. You've got to use your imagination a little bit. And it's an E chord, so we're gonna strum from the low E string. Remember that bass note gives context to everything else we hear, so it has to be an E. Here's our D chord. Again, we're aiming for good fretting position. This is a chord where we can actually have excellent fretting position. You can see both of these fingers are 3/4 of the way up the fret, and so is my 3rd one. One thing people often do when they play the D chord is they'll play it kind of straight on, where these fingers aren't like above each other, and that doesn't give us good fretting position. So what you want to do is kind of rotate the hand a little bit, line up the 1st and 2nd finger so they're right above each other, and then add the third finger. That gives us excellent fretting position all round. This is a D chord, so we're going to strum from the D string because that bass note gives context for everything else we hear. Here's a good little hack to remember the D chord. We have 2 fingers in the 2nd fret, and we have the 3rd finger in the 3rd fret. If you forget the shape, keep that in mind. 2 fingers in the 2nd fret and the 3rd finger in the 3rd fret. I also like to think that this D chord looks kind of like a capital D if you join the dots. Again, we've got to use our imagination a little bit, but these memory hooks will help you keep the chords in mind. And here's a list of songs you can play using A, E, and D. Some of them you might need a capo. You can check the article on guitarnutrition.com and it will have all of those capo references for you. So now we've looked at 3 chords. These are the first 3 chords we want to play on the guitar, and we're going to learn 3 more. Minor chords, minor versions of these 3 chords. And this is where we can really see how the compounding effect of our learning starts to happen. If we haven't played any chords on the guitar before, learning those 3 chords is 3 entirely new things. But because we have that knowledge to draw from and reference now, when we learn these new minor chords that we're going to look at, we're able to take what we know and adjust it to get the new shape. The learning curve on the guitar kind of goes like this. When we're starting out, it's kind of flat, might take a long time, but as we learn more, it starts to do this, and then it just goes up. And the reason for that is our knowledge begins to compound. So we know our E chord. Well, now we want to play A minor. So in order to do that, we're just going to move every one of these fingers down a string and play from the A, because it's an A type chord. There we go. That's A minor. That's nice and straightforward, right? We're able to draw from knowledge we already have to play a new chord. Our E minor chord is just as straightforward. We're going to start with our E major chord again, remove our first finger. That's our E minor chord. And our D minor chord, this one's a little more obscure, but there are a few memory hooks we can use that will help us remember this. It's a D type chord, so we're going to strum from the D string. Because we are reaching over 3 frets, I like to think about using the corners of the tips of our fingers rather than straight up the tips of our fingers. If we're using straight up the tips of our fingers, it might be a little hard to reach. But if we use the corners, we can get that excellent fretting position, which will help us get some really nice clarity on the chord. So for this one, what I like to think of is the fact that it's similar to our D chord. These 2 notes here are the same, but now we have our first finger in the first string and the first fret. So it's similar to the D. 2 of the notes are the same. We've got to rearrange our fingers to facilitate that, but we put our first finger in the first string in the first fret and then play the other 2 notes of D. D minor. Now, you might notice that our major chords have kind of a happy sound versus the minor chords, which are a little more sad to hear. Always a good idea to think about what the sound actually makes you feel when you're learning a new chord. That's another piece of information we can associate with the shapes that we're learning. There is one really important thing to keep in mind as we're learning these minor chords. I know I said that an A minor chord is just an E major down a string, but the A minor shape is in no way related to the E major shape. It is a pure coincidence that we use the exact same shape, just down a string, to play an A minor chord. A minor and E major are not related in the slightest. It's just important that we get that in our head because we don't want to start thinking that E major and A minor are the same thing. They're 2 very different things. They just happen to use the same shape. So let me explain why they happen to use the same shape. This is not, this is a little bit of music theory. It's not super relevant that we understand right now, but it's a good idea for us to see how this kind of gives us this idea. So if I play my A major chord and compare it to my A minor chord, we can see they're exactly the same. All I'm doing is taking this note here and moving it down 1 fret. I'm taking that top finger that I'm playing and moving it down 1 fret. Obviously, I have to change my fingering to do that, but I'm just taking the top note, the top finger, and moving it down 1 fret. Same with the E major. I'm taking the top finger and moving it down 1 fret. In this case, that means I'm now playing an open string, but it's the same idea. I take my top finger and move it down 1 fret. With my D major chord, I take the top finger and I move it down 1 fret. We have to, again, rearrange our fingering to make sure we can play that. But I take my top finger, move it down 1 fret. So you can see that the relationship for each of these chords between the major and the minor is exactly the same. We're just taking the top finger and moving it down 1 fret. Top finger, down 1 fret. It's just a coincidence that E major and A minor happen to also have the same shapes after we do that. Here are some songs you can play with your new minor chords. Check the article on guitarnutrition.com for a full list and the capo recommendations. Okay, these next ones are a little tougher. We're getting into the hard chord zone. I've said before that I don't think there is anything really objectively hard on the guitar. There's a few things, but often it's just that it's unfamiliar. And so this C and this G chord that we're about to learn, yeah, like you could say they're a little bit harder than the previous ones we've done, but they're not really. They're just unfamiliar. I think this is often a better way to think about things, because if you look at a new chord or a new technique and think, oh my gosh, that's so hard, it can kind of like trip you up mentally a little bit. Whereas the only reason it's hard is because we're unfamiliar with the movements. We haven't conditioned our hands to be able to play them yet. So let's have a look at our C chord. We've got our third finger, 3rd fret, A string. Second finger, 2nd fret, D string. First finger, 1st fret, B string. And there's no C string, so we can't play from the C string. If we find ourselves in a situation like that, where there's no open string associated with the chord, what we do is we play from the lowest finger. So in this case, that's the A string. Just like with D minor, this chord is made easier by using the corners of the tips of our fingers. Rather than trying to stretch them sideways, like it's just not gonna work, we wanna use the corners of the tips of our fingers. G involves a bit of a reach as well, but this time we're kind of reaching like vertically as opposed to horizontally. We've got our 2nd finger in the 3rd fret, low E, and our 3rd and 4th fingers, 3rd fret on the B and the high E strings, and then we're playing the A string with our 1st finger in the 2nd fret. This is one where we really have to think about using tips of the fingers so we don't accidentally mute the open strings and the ones below that. Now, I like to think that this G chord kind of looks like a, you know that font with the lowercase g? It looks like that, right? A little bit. We use our imagination. These memory hooks are supposed to help you think of the chords and get familiar with the shapes. They're allowed to be a little bit silly. So now we know all of the chords necessary to play the 4-chord song, which is the most popular chord progression in pop music. You might have heard this progression before. Very common. Or maybe flip it around. There's a million songs that use this progression. You can check out all of them on the article on guitarnutrition.com. And you can play them all. Capo recommendations there as well. Okay, this brings us to the 9th chord, F, which is objectively hard. I said earlier that I think there are very few things on the guitar that are objectively hard. Most of the time, it's just that you're unfamiliar with them. The F chord is something that I would consider objectively hard. It also happens to be an extremely useful and versatile shape, so it's worth learning. Now, don't worry if this one sounds like absolute trash for a while. What we want to do is make sure that we understand the correct technique and that we're able to move in the direction of playing it correctly. And as your hand starts to develop the strength and the dexterity, you'll find you are able to play it with clarity. A lot of the time people take shortcuts with this chord because it ends up them getting a better sound quicker, but it will cause problems in the long run. You don't want to take shortcuts with this chord. Even though you'll get a better sound sooner, it's not worth it. Okay, so to play the F chord, what we want to do is start with our 2nd and 3rd fingers, kind of like our C chord, on the D and the G strings in the 3rd and the 2nd fret. Again, like the C chord, we're going to use the corners of the tips of our fingers for a good reach. Now what we want to do is kind of bring this first finger in, flat across 2 strings. Now what you'll notice is that I have a nice rounded shape here with these fingers, but this one here is flat. We're kind of like bending it back the way it doesn't want to go. It's like you're pinching something, pinching the neck of the guitar. Now, this is difficult and this will take some time for you to get used to. What you don't want to do though is kind of grab the guitar, pull this finger against the 2. Now you can see that, you know, I've got this rounded shape. It's not flat. It's not bent back that other way. It's this rounded shape, you know, and then I grab these ones. This is the hack that a lot of people use to try and get a good sounding F chord, because you can get a good sounding F chord sooner using, I'm not even going to say technique because there are so many problems, but if you do it this way, you'll get a good sounding F chord. Here's why I don't want you to do it this way. When you hold it like this, you're creating so much friction on the neck, it's going to be hard to move around. Also, when you hold it like this, you're pulling down the bottom and you're kind of opposing the force up here, which is this really weird rotation. It's not comfortable, it's not easy to hold, it's a problem. And one of the nice things about F you can do fun stuff like that with it, which you can't do if you're doing it this other way. Let's just mention a few things to do with good technique for F. It might take you 2 weeks. It might take you 4 weeks. It might take you 2 months before you get a really nice sounding F chord. But if you move in the direction of good technique, you'll be conditioning your hand, developing strength, developing dexterity, and you will end up with a really great sounding F chord. If you take shortcuts, you won't develop any of that strength and dexterity, and it'll just cause you problems down the line. So don't do that. One other thing that people often do with this F chord that makes it difficult to get the technique right is they have these knuckles too far back. So these knuckles here, you want to think about bringing them forward. In order to do that, your thumb also has to be kind of down. We can't have our thumb up here. Otherwise, it's really hard to flatten that first finger. So thumb down, flatten that first finger. I also like to think about starting with these 2 fingers first, and then you just kind of pull that first finger in like that. There's a better way of starting it. It's much harder to start with that first finger and reach out with these ones. So if you can do this, you know, some people can bend that first finger more than others. It doesn't have to be far. You're able to develop more strength and dexterity, but if you're able to do that, then you're able to play the shape. That's F. It sucks, but it's worth taking the time to get right. Once you've got it, you're able to play your 4-chord song now in the key of C. Or the other way around. And if you can play in the key of C and the key of G, and you understand how to use a capo, you can play in literally every key on the guitar. All right, let's talk about a final idea that's super, super important. A lot of the time, when people learn the guitar, they just think about the physical aspect of it, right? We're strumming the guitar. We hear it. It sounds like something. But there's also the intellectual aspect. We've got 3 types of understanding: physical understanding, intellectual understanding, and oral understanding. That's our listening. We need to make sure we're engaging that intellectual understanding properly. So I like to use this concept called mental bandwidth. If you think about how bandwidth works with a computer, it's the same idea. Let's just say we've got this much mental bandwidth, and we're using new chord shapes. We've got to think about those. Maybe we're playing F. That's hard. I still find F hard. I am just able to change to it with no issues. I still am aware that it's not an easy shape. But, we've got this much mental bandwidth, and right now it's probably taking all of it for you to play the chord well. Maybe we're not even playing the chord well, it's just taking up all of our mental bandwidth. As you get more comfortable with the shapes, it will require less of your mental bandwidth. So maybe I've got this much mental bandwidth, but it only takes like this much of my focus and attention for me to play F. So it's fine. Like, I can be aware that it's a hard shape, but it only takes up this much of my mental bandwidth, so it's not an issue. But if you've got this much mental bandwidth and it's taking up like way more, then we're going to get a rough shape. So this idea of mental bandwidth is really important to understand, because often when you start playing chord progressions or songs, you might have a great sounding chord. You've practiced your D, sounds fantastic. You've got your G down. You're like, yes, they sound great. But then you start playing a song and something like this might happen. You'll be, you're strumming it, it'll be sounding good. And then you'll have a really bad change. And you're like, oh my gosh, I thought I had the D down. What's happening? I can't play guitar. People get discouraged by that. But think of this concept of mental bandwidth. We needed all of our attention, all of our mental bandwidth to play a pretty sounding chord. Now, we're playing a chord progression. We're strumming. We're thinking about what's coming next. We're thinking about trying to keep this motion going through the chord change so we don't stop. Because if you play the G and then you stop to change the chord, you're not playing a song anymore. You're just playing a different chord. So we want to keep this motion going through the chord change, right? Now, this is a new thing too. It might take 80% of your mental bandwidth to strum and play through the chord change. So if it's taking 80% of your mental bandwidth to strum and play through the chord change, and you need 100% of it to play a really nice sounding chord, but you're using 80% of it, that means you only have 20% left to play a really nice sounding chord. So it makes sense that the chord is probably going to sound really average. It's fine. We're working on 2 different things. On one hand, we're working at getting really nice, clean sounding chords. On the other hand, we're working at strumming through chord progressions and playing a song. These are 2 different things. And you don't want to judge your ability to play the chords well when you're working on this thing over here. Because when you start out, you need all of your mental bandwidth for each of those things, but you're doing both of them at once. So one of them is going to suffer a little bit, and that's fine, because as you get more comfortable, as we integrate that understanding, you'll need less mental bandwidth for each of these things, and you'll get to the point where you only need 50% of your mental bandwidth for each of the things. And then it'll start to sound really good. And then it'll get to a point where you only need like 10% of your mental bandwidth for everything. And then you can start thinking about what you're going to have for lunch while you play the song. That's the lesson, guys. Those are some hacks and memory hooks for your different open chords. Hopefully you found those helpful. And hopefully that idea about mental bandwidth was helpful. I think this is a concept that really messes with a lot of beginners because they don't understand that you're working on 2 different things. It's okay for it to sound a bit rough. As long as you understand the correct technique, it will develop over time. Leave a comment. Let me know if you would like to see a video going over how to develop strumming technique so that you can listen to any song and immediately be able to play the strumming pattern. Let me know if you've got any other questions. Like the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content. Remember, there is an article on guitarnutrition.com with a whole lot of songs you can play using these chords and what capo to use. And I'll see you next time.